ولا تقل القرآن خلق.
Alright, what's up guys? So in today's video, we're going to be talking about the historical Injil, basically the earliest gospel of Jesus and what was inside of it. What did the earliest believers think and what its theology actually was. So this video is basically just a prep for a two-part series, specifically for part 2. This is just going to give you a good overall idea of the environment and the background of what part 2 is going to really be about, so you can have a good grasp before we get into the deep stuff. But this video is still going to be designed to be highly informative. So here's what we're going to be doing. A quick intro over Q and Thomas, then we'll be looking at Thomasine dependence refutations, then going over the gospel source material, then addressing the no manuscripts objection, then looking at the actual contents of the Injil and how they line up with Islam, and then finally ending with crucifixion theology in Q and Thomas, which is going to be the big part of part 2. So let's start with the introduction to Q. So what even is Q? Q is literally the modern day scholarly consensus now. This is not fringed. Daniel Smith says this in 2005, but we still have 2023 consensus, which we'll be going over shortly. This is the highly seen scholarly position now, and scholars have known for over 100 years now that the gospels were written by anonymous authors, not eyewitnesses, and were used by earlier written sources, and that explains how Q works, which we're going to go over right now. So Helmut Koster's breakdown is going to be pretty essential. It's foundational. Later works, all of it essentially refine his works, but his works are essentially correct in its base premise. So we see that Matthew copies 90% of Mark and Luke copies over half of Mark with identical Greek wording, literary styles, sentence after sentence. We're talking over like 170 plus sentences, matching exactly, and these are up to 21 word sentences, which is just not possible. John Kloppenberg, for example, notes that some verses are up to 90% identical and some are up to 4. So if this is just memory, one wouldn't get word for word exact structure, but even if you did, in that case, it doesn't account for how some verses can be so identical and some verses can be only 4%. It shows that they actually have literary dependence on written material that's in front of them, but it's in completely different versions. The versions of these written materials that Matthew has and the versions that Luke have, different recessions of the same material, which is called Q. And as Kloppenberg also notes, it's most likely to assume the versions of Mark that both Matthew and Luke have are most likely different as well. So they most likely have slightly different versions of Mark and they have different versions of Q. Not entirely different, but enough that in some versions, that's why you can see only 4% identical wordings in the same exact quote. So when was Q written? The compositional layer of Q had to have been written to at least 50 AD, but it's going to have two redactional layers. The first one is going to be its compositional layer, which comes from its oral layer tradition, which is going to be dated to 30 to 50 AD, where its first compositional layer is at 50 AD. And then its second redactional layer, it's going to be its eschatological layer, which is in the 60s, which will be talked about soon. And then there's going to be the smaller redactional layers that you'll see in Matthew and Luke's versions. And so remember, Q is just going to be a collection sayings of Jesus. It's not going to have any narratives whatsoever. It's not going to have any crucifixion story because it's not going to have any narrative. It doesn't have any resurrection accounts or quotes. It doesn't have any quotations of Jesus predicting his death and resurrection either. It's just his teachings. You might question though, why does it not have his death and resurrection quotations if he truly said it? That's because they're not historical, obviously, but we'll get into that later. Alright, so the next topic is the Son of Man redaction in Q, and this is going to be a sensitive topic for a lot of Christians because they can't handle the idea that the Son of Man high Christology that they believe in is actually a later redaction. This is the literal modern scholarly consensus now, like the high scholarly consensus. Even Christians believe this, and I'll show later. We're talking 2007 onward, and I'll have studies the date up to 2023 that confirm this, which I'll be showing very soon. And so before this, the consensus was that the most prominent view was that the Son of Man sayings were actually authentic, but that Jesus was not actually talking about himself. He was referring to a distinct future eschatological figure, someone else entirely. And so both of these arguments actually support the Islamic narrative. So before this, the consensus was actually the prominent view of the Son of Man sayings were authentic, but Jesus actually wasn't talking about himself. He was referring to a future eschatological figure, someone else entirely. And both of these arguments actually support the Islamic narrative anyways, because it's referring to a distinct prophet. So it goes anyways with Islam. Both of these arguments work. And when we see right here in the bottom that the most prominent interpretation at that time is that Jesus speaks of the Son of Man as someone distinct from himself. That comes from a German scholar. His last name is like Todt, T-O-D-T. And that was the dominant view. But at this point, scholars have realized that the Son of Man sayings come from a later compositional stage of Q. And we see even Christian scholarship from 2010 admitting this, which we'll go over soon. And so the next stage is going to be the Gospel of Thomas, and specifically the original Gospel of Thomas. So not the version of the Gospel of Thomas that we have today, the one that's around 140 AD, that is dependent on the original Gospel of Thomas and the Synoptics, and a lot of secrecy-focused material. It's not actually Gnostic, but it's called Gnostic. And so to get to the actual real Gospel of Thomas, the original Gospel of Thomas that the Gnostic author uses, we have Abel Deconic's work, which is a reconstruction of it using methods which I'll talk about very soon. Essentially, where she gets this is from Helmut Koster's foundational works that Thomas has two major redactional layers, an original one that predates the Synoptics and one later after the Synoptics. And how he's also figured this is from the fact that the Son of Man, Son of Man sayings are not present in the Gospel of Thomas, showing that the earliest author of Thomas had a very, very early redactional stage of Q that did not yet have the eschatological sayings of the Son of Man sayings that would have been added in the 60s. And so later Deconic is using literary, historical, hierarchical, independent methodologies to determine multiple compositional layers to Thomas, using an independent methodology here. Not just saying, off of that observation here. So she's actually refined the work, determined this. And so from her works, which are foundational and still looked to today, even from critics who still have to agree with what the works essentially say, even when they try arguing against it. The earliest layers of Thomas date to 30 to 50 AD. Even critics agree to this. They still agree to this, which I'll show. Which means that it may predate the theological development inside Q. It has the earliest theology, essentially preserves the earliest theology, and it preserves the earliest traditional sayings of Jesus that we have available. So it essentially predates Q is what is being said here, especially the Q that we have access to. All right, so now the summary for the early theology of Q and Thomas. This part's going to be important because scholars now basically agree that the earliest Christians, the ones tied to the Q and Thomas community, actually held a theology that is way closer to Islam than later Christianity, even when it comes to the crucifixion. And here's what I mean when we look at the scholars. When we look at the second one, scholars point out that the earliest layer of Q and the earliest layer of Thomas reject the idea that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, despite knowing the fact that other groups later emerged that did believe it. So it's not that they didn't know about the resurrection claims, they later did even know about this, but expressed their belief in the assumption theology, which we'll explain. This is exactly what April Deconic in the second book says. She writes that the earliest followers of Jesus, 30 to 50 AD of course, saw Jesus as God's prophet, believed he had disappeared, believed that he was still alive, and believed that he was active within his community, and that he absolutely did not believe in a salvific resurrected Christ. Daniel Smith, the third book, this is going to be a foundational book for the later part of this topic. His book goes over almost all of the scholars here, all of the recent scholars, including the Christian ones, including the critics. It's going to be a very essential book here, very, very. According to Smith, Q knew that Jesus must have died, but they had a strategy explaining that his death, limiting it to an assumption-related theology. What does assumption theology mean? He explains in his book, assumption theology is when they believe that he's exalted up to heaven like Elijah, but it just appears so. He's going to come back essentially first. So it's essentially just the Islamic belief, guys. I'm going to keep it real with you. It's just the Islamic belief. Literally just the Islamic belief. And Like, it's pretty funny that it is literally that, but we're going to get into how that is. Okay, so next we're going to be looking at some objections to what I just said, specifically objections to the Thomasine independence from Mark Goodacre in 2012. So Mark Goodacre does not even believe in Q theory, and his whole book is essentially an attempt to refute Thomasine independence. Now I want to point out, Goodacre rejects Q, even though most modern scholars do support Q, because the literary dependence is so obvious at this point. We're talking about decades of scholarships pointing that Matthew and Luke used earlier written sources. The rational logic just coincides with it. That's why Q is the consensus. Mark Goodacre rejects it on some reasons which we see are not very logical very soon. So this is very important because sometimes people just love to say scholars are lying about consensuses, right? And so they don't care about when someone says a consensus. So Mark Goodacre in 2012 says that the majority of scholars date Thomas, 50% of them date it to pre-synoptic, and the other 50% date it post dependent on synoptics. The ones who date it to post dependency are all mostly conservative Christian apologists. And that's going to tell you a little something, right? That they're all just one group. Now, here's the thing. Why is Mark Goodacre going to lie about a consensus that he's against? In 2012, he's saying it's 50-50, so it's undisputed that by 2012, it's at least 50-50. People want to say that scholars are lying all the time. Why is a scholar who is against it lying? That makes just absolutely no sense. So we know that in 2012, it's at least 50-50 on the scholarly consensus on whether Thomas is independent or not. Next, we see that Goodacre also cites some Christian scholars who agree with Thomasine independence, like Gerd Tyson and Annette Merz, my bad, which I just wanted to point out. And he also then acknowledges that Q could historically have existed, but then he just criticizes Q for having a lack of manuscript evidence. But I have a whole slide on why this is a ludicrous belief, essentially. All right, so we'll go over that soon. So we see that one of Mark Goodacre's biggest reasons for rejecting Thomasine independence is the fact that it can verbatim copy Luke. That is just a ludicrous belief because it's only dependent upon the fact that he rejects Q entirely. He rejects the fact that they have literary dependence on a earlier source material, even though it's a complete minority position, and so that dramatically affects his methodology when approaching Thomasine independence. So when he rules out these arguments like this, it's based on irrational arguments. We know we know that the Gospels had to depend on literary materials based upon what I earlier said. It's irrational to think. It's actually ludicrous to think that. Especially when you think that they are the disciples themselves who spent like 40 years of adult literacy classes, which didn't even exist, by the way. Only child's literacy classes for the elite existed. So they would have been taking 40 years of non-existent classes to learn Greek, to write this. And then you expect them to learn to have these wordings memorized word for word after this 40 years or whatnot. That is just ludicrous. And Bart Ehrman in Foraged is the one who actually says that quote, by the way. So then one of his later arguments is that we see clear Matthean redactional statements being found in the Gospel of Thomas. So a statement that is clearly a redactional statement of Matthew that's an expansion of Mark. It's found in the Gospel of Thomas and Thomas 57. But we already see April DeConnick 6 years prior to this already explain that the Gospel of Thomas 57, has undergone an expanded transmission with secondary expansions, which refutes his position. To think that a text just goes by copyist redactional stages over decades and decades and decades and doesn't have any New Testament influence, when we already see that the Coptic one has, as John Kloppenberg states, that the Coptic version has New Testament influence inserted by the copyist, whether it was on purpose or just while they were unconsciously writing it. So it's normal to assume that a post-140 copyist would have New Testament influence while they're copying their writings, and therefore sometimes insert New Testament material into it. That's normal to believe. The fact that this only very rarely happens proves that. So here, like I just said, in the 2023 Oxford Handbook of Early Christian Apocrypha, we just see what I just said. That's where it actually was. It's not in Kloppenberg. We see that in 2023, most scholars have abandoned Goedeker's model, actually. So this Goedeker's book has been rejected, guys. So 2023, the Oxford Handbook of Early Christian Apocrypha has ruled out that we can now rule out direct copying from the Synoptic Gospels as a source for Thomas's synoptic parallels. So we can now essentially remove that entirely belief that Thomas is dependent on the synoptics for its parallels. And so we see that one should probably conclude that the Thomas version of a saying is pre-synoptic and does not involve the synoptic gospels unless there is a clear synoptic influence in it, and then you can assert that it's been a later redaction into it, but not at the compositional layer. And so, like I said earlier, I got a little bit ahead of myself. Goedeker's style is excessive because we know that copyists were under New Testament influence and have inserted their wordings into it. So it's more probable to rule that the synoptic influence is a later redaction rather than its original composition. This was 2023. So David Kim in 2021 says that the 2021 consensus is clearly favoring Thomasine independence, and that 2021 scholars are still going and further refining and pushing Thomasine independence to predate the synoptic materials even further. Next, we see Jesus, the Gospels, and the Galilean Crisis by Tucker Furta and edited by Dale Allison. These are both Christian scholars, by the way. And so we see Furta write that for arguments in favor of Q, I find the following treatments compelling, and then he puts on John Kloppenberg. Well, John Kloppenberg believes in the Son of Man redactional stages based upon Q's methodology with Thomas and its literary received material. I'm not going to go over it too much because I'm going to go over it very soon, but its literary received material would have been established in the 60s. We'll see some scholarship on this very soon. So Furta and Allison, remember, these are both Christians. They argue that the Son of Man sayings are traditional but arise during an eschatological period of the church. And by this time, Furta admits that the material is completely pervious to fictionalization, as we see in part 2, at the very top. And so he argues that Jesus did traditionally quote the Son of Man sayings in Daniel 7 in an ancient Jewish midrashic style and applied it to himself, generally speaking. And then Christians later inserted predictions of his death and resurrection into his mouth, and then reinterpreted it into a resurrection account that are fabricated, as he said. And so these scholars don't entirely reject Thomasine independence, and they assert the belief that the Son of Man sayings come from a later reinterpretational compositional stage of Q, and at that time that material was completely pervious to fictionalization. So in other words, the material is fake. So next, in Constructing Jesus by Allison, this is in 2010, we see that Allison affirms Kloppenberg's base model with Q and the thought for Thomas, and agrees with April DeConnick on a certain degree that Thomas has an independency that's pre-dependent to the synoptics. So even Dale Allison Christian scholars agree to Thomasine independence, not at a full level, but to some degree, which is what we've already argued anyways. We're not arguing the entirety of Thomas's independent and pre-synoptic. That's dumb. So she's already, or Dale Allison, I don't know why I keep saying she. Dale Allison has already fully agreed to our argument, and he's a Christian, so that's funny. And what we're going to be touching up on soon in Daniel Smith's work, which Dale Allison also agrees with, is that the first Christian believers might have also, like some so-called, quote-unquote so-called, because that's how Orthodox would view them, heretics, have convinced themselves that Jesus had only seemed to die, but in reality have ascended to heaven in the manner of Enoch or an Elijah. That's assumption theory. And so we're going to be going into that in pretty good detail. But that's going to wrap up our objections and our refutation of Mark Goedeker's work. We're going to continue back on with the Q material now. Alright, so now that we've actually seen a ton of scholars backing up Kloppenberg's Q model, let's actually see what his Q model has to say. So according to Kloppenberg, all the Son of Man sayings in Q are from a later redactional stage, meaning that they're not part of the earliest layer of Q at all, and they're added in after the first composition. And Kloppenborg also agrees that the Gospel of Thomas preserves some pre-synoptic original Q statements, meaning that sayings that existed before the synoptic sayings and before editorial Q compositional layers, so before the big redactional layers set in. Now, he does say Thomas still does contain some redactional Q material, but of course these are going to come from later accretional redactional stages and not the earliest ones like April Taconic would say. So this is a 2010 book, and so I just want to remind everyone that this essentially establishes that scholars find Kloppenborg's Q model foundational, and his Q model suggests that Thomas is gonna be pre-synoptic at its earliest stages. Q dependency material that's prior to any compositional layers, and he's going to also determine that the Son of Man sayings come at a later redactional stage. So next, I just wanted to look at a visual graph of how the gospel material actually would have been originated. And so when we look at Q at a constantly evolving text, orally and compositionally, don't mind the arrow on the original Gospel of Thomas and how it's technically longer and how it comes from it looks like it's like later. That's not essentially what it means. That's just because it was there. We know that the recession of Q that Thomas has is going to be earlier than Mark's. We'd say that Thomas has a oral and literary dependence on the earliest stages of Q, when it'd be at his oral and first compositional stage. And Mark has a later oral dependency on a later stage of Q, but it's not going to be as late as Matthew and Luke's Q material. Their Q material is going to be heavily redacted with much more Son of Man sayings than Mark would have had. But there are still going to be plenty of Son of Man sayings in Mark because his Q material comes from post-60s eschatological redactional layer stage of Q, as Thomas comes from the pre-60s. Is going to come from 30 to 50 AD, and it's going to come from before the Son of Man sayings have been added into the text. And so the synoptics and early Thomas are independent of each other, but we're going to see that later the current form of Thomas does have a dependency on the later synoptics, and so we'll see some of the arrows are pointing to current day Thomas, but they're not pointing to the original. The original is independent of those texts. It wouldn't have known those texts at all. So next is the no manuscripts hypothesis. It's that critics claim that because there's no manuscript of Q or even Colonel Thomas, it must just be a theory. But that's not true for multiple reasons that we've discussed. And we don't expect any copyists past the first... as Richard Edwards says, which we'll see soon, we don't expect copying past the 1st century. And on top of that, we don't have any manuscripts in the 1st century. We have 0. So one would then have to propose that 1st century authorship for the Bible is just hypothetical because we can't produce any manuscripts from the 1st century. So Edwards says that once Gospels like Matthew and Luke came out, copyists have little need for copying Mark. And essentially we see that Matthew and Luke just entirely take it over. And so we see that Mark almost go extinct from its very little copying because copies just had no need to copy it. And that's why the oldest fragment from Mark is dated to the late 2nd to 3rd century. So we don't actually expect them to be continuing to use the collective sayings Gospels once they've transformed them into a narrative form. But the fact is we know that a collective sayings pre-synoptic text did exist because of Thomas and its dating. So to suggest that it was entirely made in 140 AD, entirely synoptic dependent, has been entirely ruled out as foolish by today's standards, as we've just seen. Okay, we're going to be moving into the next major segment of this video. We're going to be looking at the contents of the Injil, meaning what was the actual authentic material that Jesus said and how could it mention or prophesize Islam, or how's it compared with Islam. So first we're going to look at Thomas 20. This saying goes back to the original Gospel of Thomas, not the later version. And the same parable also appears in Q as well. It also appears in the canonical Gospels that we have today. This is the mustard seed parable. But here's the Q part, right? We have established that Thomas's version is independent from Q, and Q's version is independent from Thomas, and they are both pre-synoptic. They can date back to as early as 30 to 50 AD. And so this parable is authentic, pre-synoptic, and it goes back to the earliest Jesus movement. And so we see here that the Quran has clear knowledge on this parable and is quoting it. and it treats this as authentic Injil material. And so the Quranic author clearly knows authentic parable material, and on top of that, it interprets this as it being a prophecy about the Sahaba. Not only is it very intimately knowledgeable with the authentic material, it's able to reinterpret it into ways that apply it right onto Islam. And we'll go and see soon that this is not just a coincidence, because first of all, this is not something that's often quoted. The Quran doesn't often quote numerous parables. This is something that it rarely does. So the fact it does this multiple times, which we'll see, shows that it has very intimate knowledge with its material. So the next parable we see is in Thomas 64, and it's going to be the parable also found in Matthew 22. So it's the wedding banquet parable here, and the servant, of course, returns back to his master and then goes out and then calls out to the Gentiles, calling out all people, bringing back whoever you can find to the dinner, and that would be interpreted as the Gentiles. We see, of course, that the Prophet, on whom be peace, has explicit foreknowledge on this verse via the angels, saying that this is about him, even though he's never been able to have access to this verse, right? And note that this is found in Matthew 22, yet the version Matthew 22 is actually a little bit different. We're going to look at that soon. But the version in Matthew 22 is actually clearly different than the Thomasine version. Yet the quote that we find in this hadith is paralleled with the Thomasine version, which is pre-synoptic. It's actually much closer to this one, which shows that shows that this is not just him copying off the Gospels and then attributing it to the angels. Rather, it truly is the angels attributing it upon him, because they're using the most authentic version of this parable. But when we look at Matthew 22, we actually see that this parable is also found within here, because it's also in Q. So in Matthew's version, this time we see he also talks about the temple. And we see in this parable that the servant who goes to the Gentiles only comes after God goes and sends his army to destroy and burn Jerusalem and the temple. And so that's in 70 AD. And so the reason why this is important is because Paul preaches to the Gentiles in 55 to 60 AD. So he does it before the temple. And so essentially, when we look at a canonical approach here, Jesus is rebuking Paul here because Paul preaches to the Gentiles before the temple's destruction. But Jesus says that the temple destroys, and then the prophet to the Gentile comes after it has been destroyed, after 70 AD. So when we accept the Matthean version of this verse, not only does it still affirm Islam, it further affirms it, and it clearly rebukes Paul as the prophet to the Gentiles. Okay, so next we're going to look at Thomas 65, and this one is important because it has a parallel with Matthew 21, and so it's also connected with the Q material. And this verse is basically an indirect prophecy about Jesus' death, but not the way that later Christianity interprets it. And so the key part here is, according to April DeConnick's interpretive commentary, that Thomas's community knew that Jesus died, but they weren't denying the fact he died, but their interpretation was that of the earliest Christian Christian Jews, and not later Pauline Christianity, which we already saw Dale Allison say that the earliest Christian interpretation was an assumption exaltation theology, and not essentially only a resurrection theology. And we'll also see that Daniel Smith heavily confirms this too, as being more established, more reasonable belief to hold that the first Christians believed in a exaltation assumption theology, and it's actually proven through Q. And so we'll see that very soon. But Thomas 65 is also going to give us a clue into that, and also the previous verse that we looked at. It's going to be a big hint in the way that the servant was sent back, but wasn't dead necessarily assumes assumption exaltation theology, as we'll look at within Daniel Smith's writings very soon. So next, Thomas 66, Jesus is quoting a psalm at the Psalms 118. I believe. Yes, it is. And it says, "Show me the stone that the builders rejected." And we see that Mark himself independently attestates this with the parable of the vineyard within Mark 12. And he's going to have the oral early composition within the narratives. So we can assume that this is an authentic, early independent attestation of the proper narration form of where this saying would be at. And so we can hold this in being within Matthew 21, which I've already explained is a parable within Daniel 7 and 9, because it's talking about the kingdom of God, Matthew 21:43. And so what's essentially happening is that Jesus is quoting that psalm and attributing it with Daniel 7, unifying these prophecies. And then the fulfillment is that the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, attributes this quotation, which is found in Matthew 21:43, found in Mark 12, found in Thomas independently, found in Q. It's an authentic verse, and he attributes this to being about himself, which means that he's the fulfillment of what Jesus is talking about. He is the fulfillment of Daniel 7 and Daniel 9. And I also wanted to point out in the narratives too that this stone that it's rejected, it only occurs after the tenets of the Matthew 21 vineyard parable have been killed, which is in 70 AD. So this only happens after 70 AD as well. So essentially what's being said here is that the prophet of Daniel 7 and Daniel 9 come only after 70 AD. I go over this in much deeper detail in my Daniel prophecy video though. Okay, now moving on to the big next final segment, which is the crucifixion theology in Q. And for this, we're going to be relying mainly on Daniel Smith's book, Postmortem Vindication of Jesus and the Sayings of Q. And so, like I said earlier, this book is absolutely crucial because it's going to cover almost all of the topics like Dale Allison, Kloppingborg, and Deconic. And so this book is going to tie it all together. And so to understand this in the cleanest way possible, we're going to start with the conclusions and we're going to work our way backwards to fully understand this. So according to Smith, Q uses assumption theology to explain Jesus's post-mortem status. And what is assumption theology? It's the belief that after someone dies, not essentially that they have died, but it appeared so, and they have been taken up to heaven and exalted, just like Elijah and Enoch. Not that when you look at the text, it never says that they died. It just says that they have been straight up raised into heaven. And so we see Smith say that even here that Q1335 is an assumption prediction suggesting a scenario of disappearance, absence, and return. Exactly like Enoch and Elijah. That's assumption theology. So essentially from this, we've established that Q essentially believes in like an Elijah-like theology, that he appeared to have suffered but did not in reality, and in fact was exalted, raised into heaven, and is going to come back for an appointed time for a certain mission. And so some other verses that we're going to like basically talk over more is like 17:23-24, which suggests an absence or invisibility and a removal and then becoming absent in some kind of fashion. And so we're going to be really proving and understanding how this is the case. So we need to understand that Q is silent on the issues of Jesus' death, resurrection, and even the passion narrative. But it has an evidence of Jesus' death and a clear strategy for accounting for his vindication, which essentially means to account for like the mourning and show it in a way that's positive. And so his work argues that the Q community views it as an assumption theology as Enoch and Elijah, as I've already expressed. And so he's going to basically show us the evidences on how the Greek wording on Q1335 is a language that's consistent with Hellenistic and Greco-Roman and Jewish Christian, early first century Jewish Christian assumption theology narratives. And so what are the Jewish Christian traditions that resemble this and prove that they would have asserted this theory and they would have been familiar with this, in fact? Well, we're going to be showing that the language of the omission of Jesus' death in Q1334 understood in this Hellenistic environment as an escape from death. Not that he had died, but he actually escaped it, and he had post-mortem assumed into heaven. And the language that we see in this is going to be similar to the 1st century BC text, Animal Apocalypse of Enoch, and even in the Bible itself with Elijah, where they are both raised into heaven. And so we even see in apocryphal texts such as the apocryphal stories as Phineas, which are traditions of his assumption and exaltation that came into an existence based upon the stories of Elijah. And this is dated to the 1st century BC, I believe, or 1st century BC up to the 1st century AD. But we see up here that the tradition goes back all the way to the 1st century CE from a pseudo-philo claim here. And we see here clearly in the text that it says that he was exalted into heaven, and this is an influenced text from Elijah. So we see here that early Judo-Greco-Roman Christians would have already had assumption theology related beliefs and associated it with the death or mourning of an individual, which we'll actually look at more examples of. So Smith then again asserts that post-mortem assumption theology was understood in Greco-Roman and Jewish materials, and was also considered to be an escape from death. So they would have understood him to actually be escaping from death, even if it appeared that he had died. And so Smith explicitly states that. I just want to make that clear too. And so we see in more Jewish literature, the Book of Wisdom and the Testament of Job, which are both 1st century BC texts. These both are texts in which it applies assumption theology into individuals who have clearly died, meaning that they also have now in these texts essentially escaped from death. And we see that the Testament of Job uses the language from the Elijah narrative too exactly. So it's using the same type of language that also 1335 uses as well of Q. Just keep that in mind. Therefore, upon that case, because the post-mortem assumption reverses the injustice of the untimely death of the installed individual, this would therefore supply a assumption-related vindication for Jesus, as Smith says. And he's going to show how this is actually a sufficient and more sufficient vindication than the resurrection. And so, slightly off topic, but still on this topic, the Elijah assumption also allows us to provide a framework for understanding Jesus' eschatological role as the Son of Man. And this establishes that his return would be an earthly rule. And so even when we apply the Daniel 7 rulings as such, it would still only suggest earthly rules, which were, if you look at my video in Daniel 7, I'm completely fine with attributing it in that way. So on top of that, it's clearly established that the Q and Thomasine communities would have believed in an earthly established rule of the return of Jesus in his second return. And so, like I've already established, we see that Q 1335 is clearly using assumption theology on the basis with the association with the eschatological function between early Christian Christology and how they understood his lament, which is found elsewhere in the other verses of Q that we saw earlier. And we also know that 1335b explicitly is a later redactional addition in the later stages of Q, essentially expresses the belief or legitimization of the belief, their theology. So the fact that this is a later assertion shows that this, not that it's necessarily entirely fake, but it's showing that they're reinforcing this as this is their belief. So they're enforcing this as a belief set, essentially. This is more so like a doctrinal belief enforced into the text. And so Smith notes that the assumption theology explains the hopes of the community better than any resurrection theology would, and we see that the exalted assumption theology functions essentially normally as any exalted represented figure in Jewish writings. Smith is also inclined to believe that Mark's gospel also shares a assumption theology based upon its lack of resurrection accounts and its empty tomb story and whatnot. I'm not going to go too much into that because I'm not actually talking deeply about Mark, because we know that Mark's Q version still comes from a later version of the Q redaction. So while his narratives are still mainly for the most part authentic, the way we're going to know what's truly authentic is based upon the earliest Thomasine and Q redactional stages, and then we apply it to Mark, and that way we know what narratives are Mark can be assumed to be authentic. That's how we'll determine what narratives from Mark are authentic, and that's why I'm not going to be talking too deeply about Mark here. So we're not going to be going over why he thinks Mark believes in this, but that does establish that multiple communities would have believed in this, and that's going to be important for part 2, and that also establishes that the Thomasine community would have shared the same crucifixion theology with Q. So next we see that Smith says that the Greek wording usage of Q with the Son of Man in this instance is very rare, and so there's the high possibility that it's using assumption theology together with Psalms 18 to solidify the claim that he is the coming one that's exalted into heaven and going to return for a specific position. And we see that scholars have also taken up this position. Like we see Zeller and John Noland states that the early Christians would have appealed to Jewish traditions and figures that would have been exalted into heaven in preparation for a future role. Kloppenberg also sees a connection with assumption theology and its eschatological function in Q, showing that it would account for the fact that Q accords no death, no special salvific significance, and jumps immediately to the return of the Son of Man. And so Kloppenberg as well also sees a coherent connection with the assumption theology. Risto Uro also views such passages that Zeller suggests as helpful for what Q may presuppose. And also Uro also agrees with the absent Lord theology in Q 1335b. And so what's important to note with Psalms 118, which we just saw would have been paralleled with the Q community, is that James Tabor in the Jesus Dynasty says that the historical Jesus would have thought he would have been saved based upon the Psalms he was quoting, like Psalms 118. In fact, he goes on to say that the Islamic Jesus closely resembles his historical Jesus in his summaries, while the Christian Jesus does not. So if we actually take this parallel with Psalms 118, then it's even more fair to assume that they would have assumed that the Messiah was saved from his death, because that's what Psalms 18 tells you. 118. So here, this is also another important piece of evidence that in Greco-Roman consolation tradition, like in the Book of Wisdom, assumption language is used with the conjunction of divine love in order to console those mourning the loss of a young person. And for this reason, Jesus' assumption hinted in Q has to be observed as the most coherent explanation for this verse. And on top of that, for the Christians at this time, it would have provided a very significant reversal of shame, actually one that we would have seen them to be expected, and one that clearly in a Greco-Roman and Jewish Christian context would have been sufficient. And so for this reason, Smith goes on to say that assumption theology would have been just as a suitable vindication as the resurrection, especially given the way that their language parallels with the Greco-Roman culture. I didn't go over the Greco-Roman culture, but it's mostly over like some figures I think that we'll see next slide, but I don't really go over it. I'm not going to go over it individually. So we see here, I'm not going to know how to name this, Anus. Oh my goodness. Oh wow, I said that terribly. You could see how I came to that conclusion. Memnon, Eristus, yeah, we're going to stop there. We got some more over there. I'm not going to say any of those names anymore. But yeah, like I said, Smith here is going to express what I just said, that the environment the early Christians would have been, even as well as the fact that the Elijah assumption itself is in the canonical Bible itself, that the environment that would have been in, it's the most probable assertion to assume that the assumption vindication is the most best fulfilling theology and vindication for the early Christians at that time. It's the most fulfilling for them. And so that wraps up the crucifixion theology of Q and Thomas. And so for our conclusions for part 2, what we need to wrap up and remember for part 2, because this video was just so you can get a good understanding of the early material. So part 2, you go into it already understanding what the early material was like, but now you're getting it proven with first-hand sources. And so we've established that the Synoptic Gospels are texts that presuppose redacted Q source material as authentic, such as the Son of Man quotes, and that some Jewish communities had access to written Gospels that were before the Synoptics were even written. So keep that in mind for part 2. That's going to be very, very important, because that's what it's going to be about. It's going to be about the early crucifixion absence in Christian writings and theology, and how the earliest Christians would have believed that Jesus only had seemed to suffer. So yeah, with that, this video is going to be done. If you enjoyed, be sure to subscribe. Yeah, I'm out. Peace.